to the Bikeshed Podcast, where we talk about all things software engineering, our latest opinions, and all the mistakes we have made in retrospect. I'm your co-host, a walking ventriloquist, but no dummy, Scott K. And alongside with me are my co-hosts. He built an app to manage his finances, but still went over budget, Matt Hamlin. And the king of calm, the rattlesnake of takes, Dylan, spicy, take, curry. Fellas, what's on our agenda today?
The one version rule, Scott. Take it away, Matt.
But Dylan, what is the one version rule? Hopefully we get to talk about that. I think today we're kind of, generally talking about dependency management for maybe front-end projects. Maybe we branch out of that. But the one version rule is something that we had adopted at Wayfair related to dependency management. So we want to talk a little bit about it. And this is kind of like hot on the tails of our Monorepo Madness episode, which we got some feedback from the community about, like, what about dependencies, or how do you manage dependencies? So I figured it would be good for us to dig into that. I think there's a lot of interesting things to dig in here. So obviously, like how we manage dependencies in monorepos at Wayfair, and then maybe how we've moved to manage dependencies at other companies. I think I can talk a little bit about HubSpot's dependency management strategy, which is pretty unique. I haven't seen it used anywhere else, actually. So I think it'll be interesting to dig into that. Let's see, where should we start? I guess, like, on the topic of, or I guess, maybe remind you a little bit, dependency management, for those that don't know, but I feel like most of our audience does know, is that in the front-end space, we use a lot of NPM modules, Node Package Manager modules. Those are just like libraries and bits of code that people distribute across NPM, and then you pull it into your project by declaring a dependency on it. And people can update that library over time and publish new versions, and you have to sort of, by default, you have to go in and sort of make an update to your project to pull in that new version. So like dependency management is sort of like the work that is required to, manage your dependencies, like pull in new versions, manage breaking changes in those libraries if there are any, keep track of maybe there's like a change that wasn't marked as a breaking change in the library, but it broke things for you, and so you need to like manage how you deal with that in your project. I don't know. That's maybe I'm sort of like just saying the obvious, but that's what we're covering today. Where do you guys want to start? Should we start with the one version rule? I feel like that's maybe an interesting topic to dig into, but are there some more basic aspects of this that we should cover?
Let's just dig in and see where it takes us.
Let's talk about maybe the one version rule. Like, can you sort of elaborate to our listeners, like, kind of like maybe if you know the sort of impetus for why we chose or why we decided to sort of reach for the one version rule at Wayfair?
I can kind of give my perspective. I definitely wasn't a part of all the decisions made to why we ended up going that route. I think it's part of it was a need of, we were running into issues with too many teams using different versions of libraries. It was really hard to like reconcile that and take all that code and build an app out of it without shipping multiple versions of different libraries, which is a waste. So maybe that's a big part of it. But also I think there's like an industry like shift towards one version rule, because everyone started to notice, hey, we can ship smaller bundles if we're all using the same version. Also, it just makes the most sense to only use one version of React, for instance. We shouldn't be shipping 26 versions of React. Like, what are we doing? This is stupid.
Yeah, for sure. And certainly, like, React is like a good example to look at, primarily because it like usually only works like a singleton. So like if you have multiple versions of it, you're probably gonna run into some bugs at runtime. I'm sure most people have probably seen that error, like, make sure React and React DOM versions are the same, and like make sure you're not pulling in multiple different versions of React or React DOM on your page, leading to like the hook errors or whatever there were. I think more generally, like what you're saying, it's like you don't want to, if you're pulling in a library, whether it's internal or external, into your application, like you don't want to pull in multiple different copies of it just to like have your customers load, 3x the JavaScript they need, for example, if you're pulling it in 3 times.
I think you noted this, but it also would cause all sorts of types of pain when trying to use, say, okay, for example, a library, like something that might be used in multiple places. If you're pulling in all sorts of different versions of that, there might be some conflicts. It would cause all sorts of pain there. That would make it just difficult. This can happen within a dependency as well. If a dependency you're using relies on a different version, I think we've seen this with Storybook. If it internally is using a dependency you have, that's a hard problem to figure out. There are ways around that, but it just kind of gives you a more clear guideline on this is where we're at. We're trying to continuously move forward, and we're all working off the same common infrastructure. So when someone goes into a new library or a new application, they have a little bit more common knowledge that the entire team is trying to share and build off of. It allows us to continue to move fast, continue to grow, and for people to have a dedicated understanding that we're moving towards the same common goal. And it doesn't allow an application to get as stale or be like, this is just the way things are, or it's so difficult to untangle that we don't want to invest the time, and just create this epic tech debt that eventually would likely get blown away, or cause us to slow down a merge for getting something live if we have a really tight or stressful deadline for building something. We don't want to let like one ancillary dependency or a series of them make things more difficult, or we don't want to have an engineer jump from application or library to realize they can't use certain tools that exist. We want to have consistency so people can move fast everywhere.
Say move fast everywhere. I think there's like a drawback to the one version rule, which is if I'm a library developer or I'm making changes to the application, whatever, and we're working in a monorepo, maybe there's multiple applications, and now I want to like upgrade a specific version of some package. That could be like a really big project all of a sudden, right? If it's if we're using one version rule and all apps are using this package, it's no longer like I'm just updating this package for my app. I'm updating it for everybody, basically. And maybe that's something we get into. Maybe there's a gradual upgrade process that's still in a version rule where you can upgrade one project, but that seems to sort of break the rules of one version rule in a sense. Like I've already seen that like I want to upgrade from next 14 to 15, and it's become like a project where now I'm upgrading every app, and it's just, do I really want to do this? Like this is too much for me.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think, and it's not directly coupled to one version rule itself, but just like general dependency management. I think also like managing upgrades, especially breaking changes, is pretty hefty in the front end ecosystem. Like there's quite a bit of effort that's required usually to manage those upgrades, and I think oftentimes maybe teams are in my experience, oftentimes teams aren't jumping at the bit to manage dependency upgrades all that frequently, which I think sort of leads to this like negative feedback cycle of like, okay, you don't upgrade from React 18 to React 19, or I don't know, maybe a better example, you don't upgrade from React 16 to React 17, which was like actually a relatively minor upgrade, and now 3 years later they're on React 19 and you're still on React 16, and now the upgrade process is like maybe 3x the effort, right? Because it's the breaking changes from, you have to like manage like multiple different sort of phases of breaking changes, and so I think it's oftentimes you see teams like maybe fall behind on updates, and that like sort of leads into this case where it's like, okay, now you have to like do a lot more effort to update, and so then maybe teams are like, well, it's not really worth the effort, I just want to keep shipping stuff, and so like you keep pushing it off, and then you find yourself 5 years later and it's like, oh, they're pretty far behind. Part of me wonders if that's like why many teams choose to do a rewrite instead of sort of incremental adoption. Like it's easier to start from a fresh slate and with the like current version of dependencies. But maybe that's like a separate topic that we dig into.
Well, I think that always comes into like what are teams' priorities. We've talked about this, maybe not on the podcast. When you're on a platform team, your priorities of managing dependencies, getting out new features, that's very pivotal to what you're doing. You really want to unlock the latest and greatest. You want to make sure things stay more performant. These are the kinds of features we're getting out of new React versions. And if teams' priorities are to like build a new feature, and they're not worried about maybe the larger minutia of how the application works, but rather the downstream effects on how it impacts them. So what you're saying, Matt, where maybe you end up on React 16 and 19's out, and then now there's this stress because React 19 actually unlocks this feature that we really, really need. And teams are more likely, so this is the concept I wanted to get to. Teams are more likely to be willing or be part of an upgrade when it unlocks something for them. This goes like double for almost anything. Basically, whether it's a new component in a component library or it's a new way to gain performance, teams start to get eager to have this when they have that pain point. So basically, I'm just bringing up a rule of thumb that I want to speak for everyone, but I feel like we found it painful often to do upgrades if they're not easy. Code mods usually are one way of making it easy, but also if teams are getting something they want, you're more likely to gain traction with those folks.
I think I don't necessarily want to derail the current topic, but I think an interesting maybe sort of uh, I don't know, like a sort of an interesting sort of look at here also in terms of dependency management. Like we're talking a lot about the pain. I think it might be interesting for me to share a little bit about HubSpot's dependency management sort of lifecycle because it sort of directly targeted at resolving that pain. At Wayfair, we opted for a monorepo to try to like resolve some of that dependency upgrade pain, where it's like, okay, you release a minor version of library, you now either you need to go in and upgrade all your consumer, like all the apps that depend on you, to use the new version, or tell those teams to do that work for you, and like hope that it gets prioritized, like what Scott was saying in terms of like you got to kind of need like work with those teams to prioritize it. At HubSpot, we sort of took I wasn't here for it, but like from what I've seen, they've sort of taken like an interesting path where what we have is a evergreen dependency system, which means that basically on every push to a library, as long as it's not break and change, all your downstream consumers will automatically pull it down next time they build. And we have internal build tooling that like kicks off those builds for those consumers. And they can sort of deploy, if they're in continuous deployment, they can deploy right after, or they'll just be deployed next time they go to do a deploy. So effectively, you're using a dependency management service, or like you're managing dependencies, but you don't really have to think about it. It sort of gets automatically pulled down for you and used anytime you run builds locally or builds. Now there's trade-offs to that. There are different trade-offs, but I think it's an interesting sort of conceptual model to like see like, you like for the most part, library upgrades aren't really a thing here.
That's as soon as you said that, I was like, that's forced upgrades. You're gonna like break my app and I'm not gonna know why. Because like I pushed a change and then something breaks and I'm thinking, it's probably my changes. But it could be like these 6 other libraries that changed. So how do they deal with that situation?
For sure. Yeah. So there's that's like in my mind one of the largest trade-offs of the system. What we have like some internal tools that allow you to sort of test a library change across your consumers. So that could be, we have like library canaries. Basically, you like before you even merge your change on your branch, you can say, I want to canary my change of this library to my dependents or to the things that depend on me. And it'll go out and build and deploy those applications at a certain percentage for your library, and then report back if there's any major errors, which is basically like sort of the same canary process that we had in terms of deploying applications. So there's that system. We also have like a whole sort of way to like kick off builds that don't actually get deployed, but just build your library or build your dependents with your changes, and just see if the builds pass. Basically, it's like gives you a report of like, do the builds pass? Okay. Do their tests pass? Things like that. And And so, we built a lot of internal tooling to try to kind of like provide as much feedback and insight as possible into like, does this library change like cause this other issue?
That's really interesting. Curious, like I want to hear a little more about that. Like, can you see a visual build, like some sort of like staging with that in that process? So basically you merge in your changes, and it has like this canary version of other upgrades. Can you go like test that manually? Look at that?
Can you rephrase that question? Like, are you asking like, can you verify those changes before being released to prod, or like in your consumers, or?
I guess what I'm asking is it builds it, right? And that's like some CI, CD stuff. Great. Can you go then use that application that got built somewhere in like a staging environment?
Yeah, there's we have like preview deploys, so you can
Okay,
go in and like kick off a preview deploy for an application, or like open a PR for it to like kick off a preview deploy, and then be able to like visit and see those changes, behind, in our case we're using cookies, like sort of behind a cookie, in the same way that we sort of did some preview routing at Wayfair also, like kind of similar setup. So yeah, you can preview those changes.
so you could kind of like look at even if all the CI/CD passes, you can still kind of look at the differences. I would assume they're not major. I guess it depends on how complex and how big of an upgrade. Like, would there be major breaking change upgrades that might be going out while you're doing something like that?
We don't usually do major changes, major version upgrades
Okay,
for our internal libraries. So like a lot of our libraries are, and we have a different versioning scheme than Semver, which is interesting, but it's basically we have like a major version and then a build number. So sometimes you'll see like a version number that's like 1.1234, for example, which means it's the 1234th build of the 1.x version line.
cool.
And so you can do like you can bump that 1 to 2, but most of our dependencies are still in the 1.x range, um, just because breaking changes usually don't happen. Instead, what happens usually is that teams will just go and build a new version of the library, like a separate name, and then do a migration over to that. Also, like an interesting sort of aspect is like you guys were talking about like sort of like, oh, like like how do you know like what changes are included when you deploy or whatever. It's like when we go to see our builds for specific applications, you can sort of see like each build will say like, okay, this was built because of certain dependencies changed or code was pushed or whatever, and so it lists out like 13 dependencies changed. You can click in and see like what are those dependencies, what did they upgrade from to help you like identify like, okay, I'm releasing a change that had a version bump of our internal component library, for example. And so I can kind of see when that happens.
Yeah, it seems really cool. Seems really robust.
Matt's spilling all of HubSpot's secrets about how they do
it's
dependency management.
it's I mean it's interesting. I've talked to a few other people that have worked at Wayfair and work at HubSpot now, and like I think the thing that HubSpot maybe it wasn't very clear to a lot of people internally maybe at HubSpot that I talked to, but like the trade-off that was made when choosing evergreen dependencies is that now it's very difficult to reproduce a build, right? Like because essentially every time you do a build, you're pulling in the latest. I mean, there's a flag locally that says you want to update your dependencies when you do a build, and that doesn't default to true currently. But we've talked about maybe changing that default so it always pulls in the latest. But when you do that, it's very hard to reproduce a failing build in Blazar because Blazar is our CI system that does builds, and it's very difficult to reproduce that because you don't really know what versions you need to pin yourself to it, and like if you can pin those versions locally anymore. So that's like an interesting trade-off, right? It's like build reproducibility, which is something I think we valued a lot at Wayfair. Was like we want to know, like we want to be able to like sort of roll back and say like, yep, we can reproduce exactly with the specific versions that we wanted. That was like an interesting trade-off that I think wasn't very clear internally based on our docs, that a lot of people maybe realized that was a trade-off that we made. But yeah.
So one of the things we talked about was basically avoiding breaking changes, or I guess trying to avoid breaking changes. It's really interesting because I think at Wayfair we had a lot of conversation about this, and we kind of started to land toward a camp of like, let's try not to release breaking changes unless we really need to. And I've in my limited time, I feel like here it is similar where we try not to break things. I mean, it's more robust here where it's like if they do break stuff, there's code mods. If they do build something new, there's code mods, and they get you like a good 90 to 95% of the way there, maybe even more. So there's basically we put a lot of stock into making it easy to consume these things and build developer tools, which I wish at Wayfair towards the end we had more stock in that, I guess, essentially. However, we were leaning towards this is no like one path here, but should you have libraries with breaking changes and how often should that occur? Like it's solely up to the developer, the product. But I feel like I'm seeing more, hey, let's try to avoid that scenario the best we can. How could we create something new, both at this job and kind of since we've had that consensus maybe about 2 years ago now.
Yeah, it's definitely. Yeah, I think I've seen the same trend where it's like at companies that do dependency management, kind of the way that we've seen it done. It's like I think a lot of the pressure is around like don't do a breaking change, but like maybe ironically, like the open source ecosystem is maybe not as bought into that maybe or something. I don't know. It just feels like the open source ecosystem is like major versions exist for a reason. Let's just keep leaning in and using them. And but yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to me that that doesn't seem to be a shared belief or something outside of large companies.
They call it opt-in adoption essentially. And maybe like I don't want to derail much more than this, but maybe like the problem with that is there's still like the case of that 80-20 rule where 20% never adopts. And if you incur a breaking change, you're going to have to feel the pain and you're going to have to get that done. So maybe there is something to be said about that, but also it's a lot easier when you build an open source thing to say, well, if you want it, you're going to have to upgrade, like, and you're not going to have to feel that pain or be a consumer of that pain.
Previously, we talked a little bit about peer deps and like direct deps. I think that's like an interesting thing to dig into. Like we at Wayfair, we heavily leaned into using peer dependencies for internal library sort of relationships. So like if you had a library, like say I don't know, library A, and it needed some feature from library B, it would instead of declaring on a direct dependency, so just like in-package.json dependency on library B, it would be a peer dependency on library B. So it would be up to the consumer of your library to provide library B when it's using library A. It's interesting. I think there's like some trade-offs with that. It's like you're sort of like you're saying, okay, like my consumer needs to know what I use and depend on, sort of like leak my implementation a little bit in a sense. But I think the benefit that you get out of using peer deps is that it lets the consumer decide what version they want to pull in. So if library B pushes a hotfix patch, for example, they don't have to wait for library A to make some change to pull that new version dependency into its dependencies and then consume it. They can just immediately upgrade library B and sort of get the benefit out of that fix. But I think also like the trade-offs with peer dependencies that now you're sort of trying to satisfy peer dependencies in a world where you have like a very tightly, like a lot of relationships across your dependency graph can be difficult, right? Because you can have library C that depends on library B at a different Semver major than what library A did. And so now the consumer of library A and C needs to make a choice of like which version of B do they pull in. I don't know. It's an interesting trade-off. Whereas with like direct dependencies, it's you run the risk of now pulling in separate copies of the same library, and then you're kind of at the whims of how those copies are being resolved during your build or during local development or whatnot. Like we saw some issues at Wayfair with PNPM resolutions and multiple copies, and yeah.
Matt's gonna add an Excalibur to the show notes to explain the relationship of those libraries because I'm pretty sure at some point.
I want to talk a little bit about like the setup of the one version rule that we used and basically how our mono repo looked for this example. Because at Airbnb we do something a little internal and different, which is kind of cool, maybe unnecessary. But essentially, our monorepo Wayfair had a root, or I guess global or root package.json that kind of declared those dependencies and what version we used. And consuming libraries and applications would just workspace star essentially what was there. So they were just pulling in the version that top level gave them, which is essentially the same at Airbnb, but we do something interesting where our applications and libraries don't have package.jsons. They actually use something internal that's like a project.json, which allows them to just enable dependencies by turning them on or off. And we actually don't use pair deps here. We do use dev deps and regular dependencies, but there's some internal concepts of like using what is a public dependency versus an internal dependency. So there's other concepts that are added into this that kind of make it a little different, but it enforces us to use the right version in a different way, where it's just saying, okay, hey, use this version, this dependency. You don't have the option to even set a dependency. Whereas in the structure we just described, a more common, maybe open source structure that Wayfair would use, it's just say, okay, just use the root one, and we would create a CI/CD check that's like, hey, you had to use the root one. We wouldn't allow you to pass pipelines unless that were the case. So just an interesting mechanism that we don't really give folks the option to pull in a different version.
I'm really curious, Scott, how you in that ecosystem, like within your monorepo, how do you have let's say maybe we could think of better names, but you have two internal libraries and one depends on the other. How do you declare that dependency in your setup? Scott's shaking his head like he doesn't understand the question. But
no, I understand the question. I don't know the answer. It's just a good question. I don't yet know that answer. So it's a really good question.
Because like I could totally understand your setup if for external dependencies making sense. Like you as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, at the root of your monorepo you have a package JSON, and it says pull in a dependency on React, I don't know, version 19.10, and then you have a number of different workspaces or something similar to workspaces in your repo that have project.jsons that say I use React, and just list React as a dependency, and it's just going to resolve to that React 19.1, I assume, at the root. Yeah, I'm curious how it handles internal dependencies between libraries, if that's even a thing in your code base.
Okay, between libraries that are
within the same monorepo.
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's an internal dependencies list, but
so if
it's the same concept, you just are able to turn it on or not.
So you might create a new library in your monorepo, say my new lib, and you maybe need to add it to your root package JSON as a dependency, even though it's an internal dependency.
Yes.
And then another thing in the repo can say, oh, I'm going to add that internal dependency on my new lib, and I'll just sort of do a similar resolution. Okay.
So I don't think our internal dependencies are like moot point, really. I don't think they're actually added to the root package.json, but rather there's another way that collects the information about it, that we create some sort of file. I'm pretty sure this is it. I just forget exactly what it is. We create some sort of file to say, hey, this is a library, recognize it, and then it gets pulled from there. But it's a little bit more of a complex internal system that just allows you to do one version rule without giving applications and libraries the choice about even pulling in a version. Probably overkill. I don't know enough about the entire architecture yet to say like, why did they do that? Is it just for the one version rule, or is there more to it? A lot of our internal tools are quite robust in the sense that, like Wayfair, when we used to have dev boxes, but imagine our monorepo would just spin up every application very easily. There's a little bit more caveats to that. You have to we have these things called hyperloops that power them, make sure they render. You have to set your everything up for that, but we essentially have our own internal script that allows you to spin up every application a lot simpler.
So it sounds like at HubSpot and Airbnb, these are like pretty large companies, right? You got like 5,000, 10,000 people working there total. Is that right?
Probably more.
It could, yeah.
Something. Yeah, it's a lot. I'm just getting to like even at Wayfair, the teams this size or companies this size have the backing or the amount of people needed to like invest in internal tooling. And I'm currently at a place where like all in the company is 600 people. Engineering is probably like 150. And I feel like each team is just solely focused on a specific feature set. We're getting more into like building out platform teams, but what I've seen that does for your application structure is that you end up just relying on open source tools for like 99% of use cases. So like for one version rule, we're using something called SyncPack. I've never heard of it, but it basically does one version rule for you. And I don't really concern myself too much with the tooling of things, but I'm starting to run up against a lot of issues where it's becoming really, really hard to do things. And the main reason is we don't have an internal team that's focusing on solving those problems for the developer experience. So it starts to come down on all of the developers to like spread that load across the work they're already doing, which I think is not really a great way to solve for this. So hopefully, I guess what I'm saying is I hope my company invests more time and money into internal tooling and having dedicated team members that are working on that stuff. Because hearing your guys' perspectives of like the tools you have in place to help you deal with this while you can focus on your future work does sound really nice. And I do kind of miss some of that. Having a team that could like, I could hand off some of those problems to, and they can come back to me and be like, hey, I fixed this for you. And now you can continue your future work. Like it's really hard right now for us to be like, hey, we're going to upgrade to React 19. Um, and then somebody starts to do it and then they don't have time and then it just sort of fizzles out.
Like certainly the tooling that we have, like we wouldn't be as successful as we are at a company of our size without the tooling that we have for managing dependencies at HubSpot. But I think also like you can get, I don't know. It's like we have McDonald's at home sort of meme. Like you can get some of those benefits with some open source setups, right? Like like we tried this at Wayfair, but not too much success. But like Dependabot, I think in a smaller team and a smaller code base could work very well for managing dependencies, or Renovate, whatever the latest and greatest of that sort of tooling that basically it's like sort of automated dependency upgrades that opens PRs for upgrading dependencies for you automatically. So like you could get some of those benefits like that in a smaller code base. I think once you get to a very large code base, it starts to become more of a pain. I think. I think also like not to necessarily sort of make this another AI episode, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for running something like Renovate or whatever, but with an AI sort of agent backing it. So it can do the major breaking changes where you actually need to make changes to your code base to adopt the new upgrade. Like let an agent do that for you and not have a software engineer dedicate their time towards that.
I mean, also with these tools, like I'm saying, it takes too much of my time to do it. Maybe I should be like leaning on agentic coding agents or whatever to solve these problems for me, like set these things up for me.
Yeah.
I think the path you guys are talking about makes sense, but like I have a philosophy that like building something important by committee never seems to work, not without a solid foundation. Like it usually needs a team around it. And it doesn't mean it needs to be like a long-term team, but it's usually like a problem of lack of focus on something critical because you're misinterpreting the business needs and it solves an undervalued hurdle. So like often, oh, if we just had X, like, we could do Y, and not stopping to fix that problem or whatever. It's a tiger team, or we just set aside time to get across that point, solves a problem. This is like my take with like, I think you can have a component library and design system, but if you don't do the foundational work to be like, these are the rules, this is what we're going to adhere to, and then get people on board, it's not easy to be successful. Like some of these things by committee are very difficult. So if you're have a lot of framework level problems, like solving them just by committee and passing and not taking time to focus on it is difficult. Like I do think you don't need a permanent team around it. I'm not advocating that, but sometimes these tech debt like issues that people recognize as an issue, but don't know how to stack up in value. This is what I think like Kristen did so well at Wayfair and was like, hey, we need a design system because we need consistency, because we need to stop making the same button 3,000 times. And building something around that like really empowered folks. And when it became so mature, people were like, do we really even need this? Because all the problems went away.
Yeah, I think like kind of maybe restating what you're saying, Scott. I think it's like the tragedy of the commons, right? If you don't have some sort of process or team or workflow set up to manage dependencies, just no one's going to do it, right? Like, I feel like this is the same thing we've been saying, sort of reiterating maybe the same point, but it's like you really need something to help do that. Otherwise, you fall into that, like we were saying earlier, like negative feedback cycle of like no one does it. You get further and further out of sync. No one does it because it's further and further out of sync, and it just keeps iterating.
Right. Things can become common pieces and commonplace when they're mature enough to live on their own. Like you can't just expect everyone to care about dependency management in an environment where no one's doing it or everyone's working on their own initiative. Like you need to build something that's mature enough and strong enough to be able to survive. I'm not advocating that everything can. I'm saying some things can live on their own.
All right. What else do we have to say about dependency management? We covered the one version rule a little bit. We talked about how HubSpot and Airbnb manage it, and Whoop, you guys are basically doing the what I would say maybe vanilla dependency management, right? Like a lot of open source, like using tools off the shelf. All right, let's call it there. Yeah, I guess like it. We can jump into our stand-up updates, but if people have further thoughts or questions about dependency management that they want us to talk about, reach out in the community Discord server or on Blue Sky or via text. Scott loves getting sort of random texts and DMs from our listeners about the episode, so send them his way.
Great.
Scott, what's your stand-up update for today? What shareholder value did you deliver?
None, Matt. I was going to talk about my personal life. Well, I've been doing a lot of like dad chores at home, which is I have today off and yesterday. Said today and tomorrow. Yesterday and today off. Yesterday was Juneteenth. See, look I've been so busy. I don't even know what day it is anymore. I started, but I did talk about. I started refactoring my accessibility hook. I wanted to bang it out this weekend. We'll see. It's probably not going to get done, but I started basically rebuilding it. It's probably going to be either a major version release or I'm just going to release something entirely new because I could keep the API, but I've simplified it and I'm like, it's better now. So I've been working on that, adding some features to it. At work, I'm still working on visual diff stuff. It's going to probably be a while. I'm starting to get a little nervous about it, but I'm able to. I prototyped it for the team, and they that will be using it, and they loved it. And we were able to break it down into more manageable chunks. We'll just make it purely visual to help folks at first, and then I'm going to try to add some fun features of like copying and pasting and merging. So still working through that. It's been going good. My work on that this weekend. I know that's terrible, but I kind of need to. Dylan, where's your shareholder value?
It's with the shareholders, obviously, who delivered shareholder value.
Yeah.
So.
I have options shares. No, lately, or just yesterday, actually, this is horrible. I had the day off, and I spent the whole day like vibe coding. Isn't that
Nice.
just terrible?
Wait,
Or nice? Oh, that's
I'm
vibe
proud.
coding for work or for personal use?
both. There's like a thing I've wanted to do at work that I just don't have time to do and don't know enough about to sell it yet. I've been basically I maybe mentioned on a previous episode that I was interested in like using React Query, and then I was finally like I was running into a ton of issues with loading states on a checkout page that has multiple steps. And then I was having inconsistencies with how I was loading in between in between steps because each step has different data dependencies and stuff. So I was like, screw it. I'm just gonna migrate this to React Query and see what it feels like. So I spent pretty much all of yesterday doing that. I learned a ton, and I actually feel pretty good about what I ended up with. It's like a good mix of like prefetching on server components and dehydrating that data, passing it down as props, and then reusing the same query like keys on the client, and using mutations and things like that, and adding the tan stack dev tools. Like once I get it all set up, I was like, this is pretty sweet. I'm like kind of glad I did this, and I feel like we're supposed to have a hackathon next week, and I'm like, maybe this is my hackathon. I'll just like, this is the new way we fetch data or something.
That sounds way better than what I was doing with use query, where it was like, if this hasn't loaded, render a loading state everywhere. And I was like, this feels so wrong. And then I tried to pull suspense queries in, and it was a little better, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have a repo for that? I would love to plug it in the show notes if that's personal stuff.
It's personal. I can share like a sort of chat GPT summary of the concepts covered and like what I used like to build it out. But yeah, it was fun. I got stuck on something stupid along the way. I'll quickly touch on it. We use React I18N, which is a library for like internationalization.
Yep.
And for whatever reason, we're using this like use translation hook that like dynamically loads the translations. I don't know if anyone's run into this, but what ended up happening is I would like client render a component that pulled in translations, and it was like hitting my loading TSX in Next.js, and I was like ripping my hair out, like what is happening? And it come to find out, like I think that library was like throwing a promise or something and triggering my suspense boundary, and it was blowing my mind. I was like, what is happening? But it's just, and then I was like, I'm just gonna call all these used translations higher up in the tree so that like loads all of those translation files. But it made me think like, oh, and the next thing I need to do is just refactor the entire way we do translations. But it was crazy. But yeah, that was a fun day of just like, I'm not doing work, but I'm kind of doing work. I'm doing all the things I wanted to do at work, if that makes sense.
You're doing related learnings that are good and beneficial. That's great.
I was just like, this is just going to be a net positive for everyone if it works out. And I learned a ton along the way. So that was a rant. Yay! Matt just did a clapping soundboard in
It's not going to show up in the
in
episode,
but not here. I just reacted to that. So gotta make sure to let you know. Matt, what about you?
Let's see. Yesterday,
Time.
similar.
Just kidding.
Yesterday we had the day off. Also, we were down in Stanford this last week, so we took yesterday and went into the city. I got pizza at John's on Bleecker. For those that know, it's pretty good. Highly recommend. And then also went to like the Morgan Library, and yeah, it was pretty neat. We got caught in a quick thunderstorm though, so we were like drenched for half the day. Had to dry out in a bookstore, but yeah, it was good.
Wait, Matt. Did you eat pizza at Papa John's son's pizza?
I don't know. It's called John's on Bleecker. That's all I know.
Is this fiance shareholder value? Like, where's your shareholder value?
Let's see. Yeah, in terms of actual shareholder value, I don't know what I've done. I've done a lot of migration work. Like we were talking about like internal tools and stuff for managed dependencies. Like we have a heavily well structured, well built out system for running migrations or like code mods and things like that across our ecosystem. So I've been interfacing with that a lot, but there's like, I don't want to go too deep into it, but we have this thing called Mothership that runs those code mods or migrations, and that kicks off builds across all the different sort of libraries in Blazar. And so that Mothership, there's like a dashboard that says like, oh, here's the libraries that failed to build in Blazar in CI. But you have to then click through like twice for each library that failed to build in order to expand the build log to see why it failed. and so I was starting to like hack on something Wednesday of like a little CLI tool that would pull up the Mothership mission, find all the failing builds, get their build logs, and then pipe that into Claude so that it could then sort of like summarize like why did this build fail and tell me if I need to just rebuild it because there's like a flaky test, or tell me if it's actually like an actual error related to my migration. So Dylan shared the Cruzan video on microservices. I think that's an accurate thing. Yeah.
Should I even ask Blazar and Mothership are?
Lactus.
Blazar is just a CI system. Actually, apparently, I found this out this week. We had originally open sourced it from HubSpot. So like there's a public GitHub repo called Blazar, but then we later did an internal fork of it to like add more HubSpot-y things to it. And then Mothership, I don't know how it got its name, but it does work. It like kicked off builds.
All right. I think we're out of time.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for tuning in. If you had questions, comments, feedback, share it in the community Discord server or on Blue Sky, or text Scott about it. He loves receiving those texts. Otherwise, have a great week, everyone. See you next year, month, decade. See ya.
Next time. Later.